In the early 1920s, the awkward five-passenger station situation and the fact that the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was the only road operating passenger cars through Cincinnati led to much interchange of cars between the seven railroads. Daily, some 50 to 60 through sleepers were interchanged between the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads entering the city from the north, east, and west, and the Louisville and Nashville, Norfolk and Western, and the Cincinnati Southern and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroads entering the city from the south and the east. Once again, a slight detour for the viewers not familiar with the Cincinnati Southern Railroad. The Cincinnati Southern was built and owned by the city of Cincinnati. The road provided passenger and freight service from Cincinnati to Chattanooga, Tennessee, a major distribution center in the South after the Civil War. The road was built to provide access for products manufactured in Cincinnati to southern markets. In 1881, the city would lease the Cincinnati Southern Railroad to the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad under the terms of a long-term lease. The CNO&TP would come under the control of the Southern Railway System in 1893. Now, back to our story. In the late 1880s, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Henry Ives-controlled Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad had proposed a Union Station, but the fallout from Ives's fraud upon the CH&D ended that effort for more than a decade. From 1900 onward, a number of plans for a Union passenger terminal in Cincinnati were devised. On June 30, 1904, the Union Terminal Railroad Company was incorporated under the laws of the state of Ohio to develop, run, and maintain a Union Terminal in Cincinnati. The company name was later changed to the Cincinnati Union Depot and Terminal Company after control was passed to John E. Bleakman and Archibald White's Bleakman-White Syndicate. Just a note of explanation here, the word syndicate in this era meant a group of individuals or companies banding together, pooling resources for a particular project, much like today's private equity firms. By 1904, a number of smaller cities in Ohio had built Union terminals, including Dayton. And despite all of the logistical and financial problems connected with it, the citizens of Cincinnati long dreamed of a united passenger terminal in this city. Complicating matters was the small problem that Cincinnati at that time was serviced by 15 railroad companies, some of which were owned by larger roads, but each having their own needs and financial abilities. In early 1905, there were two other groups advocating for a Union terminal in Cincinnati. An unnamed group of what was described as Cincinnati financiers were pushing for a Union terminal bounded by Walnut, Main, 2nd, and 3rd Streets that utilized elevated tracks to the proposed terminal. It was thought that this type of arrangement would prevent flooding from the Ohio River from interfering with operations. Another group, led by President Ingalls of the Big Four Railroad, proposed a terminal at 4th and John Streets. Neither project moved forward, most likely due to involvement by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The White-Bleakman Syndicate initially conceived of a large Union Terminal building to be located in the block surrounded by Court Street on the south, Elm and Race Streets on the west and east, and what was then called Canal Street, which we now know as Central Parkway, on the north. The project also included potential rails for freight traffic interchange. The estimated cost was, depending upon the source, somewhere between $33 and $45 million. That would be, at a minimum, $1.1 billion today. This group was backed by the Pennsylvania and Norfolk and Western Railroads, whose rail lines and property holdings were conveniently located near or part of the syndicate proposed site. The New York Central and the Louisville and Nashville Railroads initially supported this effort. Now, we must remember in this era, the Pennsylvania was the 900-pound gorilla of American railroads and was generally referred to as the standard railroad of the world, with unmatched finances and operational expertise. Plan for the White-Bleakman Union Station was for trains to run under the station at a below-ground level. The adjacent blocks to the west and east of the station building were to be devoted to train sheds. The primary approach to the station was comprised of an open below-ground approach accommodating at least 6 tracks and paralleling 9th Street. There was even a proposal to cover the resulting trench and use electric locomotives, similar to recently completed passenger stations in the east. And once again, we'll take a slight detour to explain the backstory for our viewers. The White-Bleakman project required the abandonment or condemnation of a large swath of buildings between Court and South Canal Streets. Both North and South Canal Streets bordered the Miami and Erie Canal that later became Central Parkway and the infamous and partially completed and abandoned Cincinnati subway of the 1920s. Existing connections from the east for the Pennsy and Norfolk and Western were already adjacent to Canal Street. There was even talk of tunneling under Mount Adams to improve access and reduce street crossings, which would have made the project considerably more expensive. As mentioned earlier, the section of rail access to the proposed terminal from Garrard Street on the west side of town to just beyond Broadway on the east would be below level grade, essentially a trench varying from 24 to 32 feet in depth to the proposed station. This approach led from the various western rail connections in the Mill Creek Valley. Think of it as a railroad version of Fort Washington Way from the Mill Creek Valley to just beyond Broadway in Cincinnati. The proposed White-Bleakman Syndicate 1904 terminal was supposed to be financed by J.P. Morgan and Company of New York, but never really got beyond the planning stage. There were a myriad of reasons for this. The Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, the dominant regional road headquartered in the city, entered receivership in 1905, which lasted until 1917. From 1905 to 1909, J.P. Morgan took ownership of the CH&D as a result of a merger arranged by the Morgan firm that had gone bad, and thus was required to fund substantial losses on the property. The nationwide financial panic of 1907, followed by the deep recession of 1908, caused further delays. As a matter of note, the CH&D would be acquired by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1917. Additionally, it appears that the railroads located on the west side of Cincinnati, led by the Cincinnati Southern, Chesapeake in Ohio, and Baltimore in Ohio, had their own set of plans for a Union station. In July of 1906, the Cincinnati Southern, B&O, C&O, and the New York Central formed their own group to explore a less costly Union station, initially budgeted at $10 million. The Pennsylvania, Norfolk and Western, and Louisville and Nashville were initially excluded from these discussions. The reason for the second Union Terminal was a concern by the Westside Railroads that construction and maintenance costs of the White-Bleakman Syndicate Terminal would be ruinous to the smaller roads. In this time period of the early 1900s, there were a number of smaller railroads entering the city that could ill afford contributing to a grandiose and expensive Union passenger station. A contributing factor was the recognition that of the 12 railroads serving the recently opened Kansas City Union Station, 5 of those roads were in receivership, essentially bankrupt. Thus, the White-Bleakman Syndicate faced various political roadblocks, resulting in both sides entering negotiations. The necessity of the White-Bleakman plan to cross various city streets into residential areas of the over-the-Rhine neighborhood was, no pun intended, a major roadblock. Then there was the contentious issue of allowing interurban railroads, then a major competitor to the steam passenger railroads, of having access to a Union terminal. Negotiations between the Westside Railroads and the White-Bleakman Syndicate failed, and both sides pressed forward on their own, making little progress. Another decade would pass before a truce would come between the Pennsy-led East Side Group and the Cincinnati Southern and Baltimore, Ohio-led Westside Roads. This group, called the Cincinnati Railway Terminal Committee, comprised executives of all of the railroads entering Cincinnati. But once again, a new roadblock emerged: the First World War. Federal government operation of U.S. railroads by the U.S. Railway Administration from 1917 to 1920 put a stop to any but the most pressing railroad projects. World War I had been hard on the eastern railroads, since this is where most of the manufacturing and population of the nation was then located. The physical plant of the eastern roads, which included the Pennsy, New York Central, Norfolk and Western, Baltimore, Ohio, and the Chesapeake and Ohio, had been run hard. Other impediments suffered by the eastern roads included new, stricter financial regulations required by the Transportation Act of 1920, which returned U.S. railroads to private ownership. These new regulations authorized the Interstate Commerce Commission to limit the return on railroad investment, along with other restrictions. Additionally, new forms of competition, trucks, passenger automobiles, grain and ore boats on the Great Lakes, and improvements on the inland rivers for barge traffic made railroad executives more cautious regarding future large investments. However, in the early 1920s, the right man for the job appeared in the person of George Dent Crabbs. Mr. Crabbs was president of the Philip Carey Company, a Laughlin, Ohio-based manufacturer of asbestos-based products and director of several other corporations. Crabbs was also director of the 4th District Federal Reserve Bank. Mr. Crabbs was interested in the Union Terminal project and surrounded himself with other like-minded men, the most prominent of whom was Robert A. Taft. The major roadblock facing this group was persuading the 7 railroads to, once again, enter negotiations to consolidate their passenger operations and to provide all of them access to a common point in the city. This access problem, long a sticking point, was ultimately settled through an agreement whereby the Pennsylvania and the Norfolk and Western railroads would gain access to the Mill Creek Valley on the west side of Cincinnati over the Baltimore and Ohio railroad tracks from a point near East Norwood. The first step of the group, headed by Mr. Crabbs, was the formation of the Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company. This company was formed as an Ohio corporation on July 9, 1923, with Mr. Crabbs being elected president. The Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company entered into extensive negotiations with the 7 railroads and drew up tentative plans for the project. On December 11, 1923, the directors of the Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company and the 7 railroads met in New York City. The 7 railroads approved the tentative plans submitted by the company and agreed that the Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company should be the organization to carry out the plans. Committees of various railroad officials were formed, studies were begun, and further meetings were held. The second step was to prepare a preliminary agreement between the Terminal Development Company and the 7 railroads. This agreement was signed on July 14, 1927. At the same time, yet another group, the Committee of 10, was set up, including 1 representative from each of the railroads and 3 representatives from the Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company. This group would eventually be called the Cincinnati Union Depot Committee. Now, it's not within the scope of this video to go into all the gory details, but the process, no doubt, was very much akin to the process of herding cats. However, it should be noted that the Cincinnati Union Terminal Depot Committee was empowered to accomplish the following tasks. Number 1, obtain the necessary property for the Union Terminal project, and number 2, be the first board of directors of the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company. The Cincinnati Union Terminal Company was to operate the new terminal. Other duties of this group were to negotiate with the city of Cincinnati and Hamilton County for all the required rights, ordinances, and franchises concerning grade crossings and street changes. Other very important items added to the to-do list for this group included negotiating a final and complete union station agreement between the 7 railroads and the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company and the Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company. As part of this, it was necessary to arrange for an exchange of property with the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad Company. This was necessary because the existing Cincinnati Southern classification yards was located on the site of the new terminal building. Other items were to obtain a chief engineer for the project and to finance the preliminary work by calling on each of the 7 railroads for up to $150,000 in exchange for stock in the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company. Ultimately, all of the necessary task and complex financing was accomplished. Colonel Henry M. Waite, a native of Cincinnati, was chosen as chief engineer for the project. Mr. W.R. Kellogg from the New York Central Railroad was selected as the real estate agent for the land required for the project. The Cincinnati Union Terminal Company agreed to procure land and build the Western Hills Viaduct to be turned over to the city of Cincinnati. As will be developed later, the Western Hills Viaduct was paid for by the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and the city of Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Union Terminal Company also purchased Bald Knob, a large hill to the west of the terminal site, to be used as a borrow pit for the fill required by the new station facility. The final Union Station agreement was prepared by Mr. Taft and was signed by all of the interested parties on June 15, 1929. The agreement provided for the operation of the Cincinnati Union Terminal by the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company. The 7 railroads were to be tenants paying rent on the basis of use. In other words, the percentage of cars and locomotive each railroad operated into and out of the Cincinnati Union Terminal in relation to the total cars and locomotives operated in and out by all of the railroads. Construction of the new Cincinnati Union Terminal facility was begun in August of 1929. The completed Cincinnati Union Terminal was opened on March 31, 1933, and the Cincinnati Railroad Terminal Development Company was dissolved on July 17, 1933, having fulfilled its purpose. The long-felt need was finally fulfilled. Mr. Crabbs, the force behind the terminal project, remained vice president of the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company until his death in 1948. Robert Taft, who was integral on the political side of the project, would become U.S. Senator from Ohio, holding that office from 1939 until his death in 1953. Join us next time as we continue with Part 3 of this series, when we delve into the need for and the construction of the Western Hills Viaduct. The viaduct solved 2 critical problems. The first, maintaining access from the west side of the city to downtown Cincinnati. The second, it provided crucial access for the 7 railroads serving Cincinnati Union Terminal. If you like this type of content, hit the thumbs up button below and share our videos with your friends. It helps the channel out. And please hit the subscribe button to be notified of new videos on our channel. We'd like to thank the Cincinnati Railroad Club and its members for the support in making these videos and our channel possible. Until we meet next time on the High Iron, stay safe out there.